Bookworms and welcome to Fully Book Chats. I'm Alex and I'm very excited to introduce our guest author for today. He is a comic book artist and illustrator known as Strungles and is currently working out of Minnesota. He received his BA from Hamline University in 2012, majoring in studio art with a concentration in oil painting and minoring in art history. He has contributed work for Oni Press, Boom Studios, Limerence Press, and Image Comics. He is particularly fond of fairy tales, kids' cartoons, and rom-coms of all stripes. The Magic Fish is his debut graphic novel, and recently it won the 2021 Harvey Awards Book of the Year and Best Children's or Young Adult Book. Let's all welcome Trung Le Nguyen. Hi Trung, it's great to see you today.
Hello, it's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you about the Magic Fish.
Yes, we are also very excited. Thank you so much. So before we dive into all the book questions, we'd like to ask you first, how are you doing and where are you calling us from?
I'm doing very well. It is currently 8 p.m. in the Midwest. I'm calling from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I live right in the city, and yeah, it's a lovely evening. It's not very cold just yet, but we're expecting snow very soon. I've just put up all of my Christmas decorations, so I'm very excited.
Yes, Merry Christmas, advance Merry Christmas,
Thank you.
and good evening. Yeah, thank you again so much for spending time with us, even though it's kind of late um, to where you are. Anyway, this is just a personal question because
Mhm.
I've watched several interviews of you with other media platforms. So, aside from asking how are your pets, your chickens?
They're doing very well. For
Mhm.
folks who don't know, I
Yeah.
have three pet chickens. So just in case folks don't know, I have three chickens, three hens. They're lovely. They're named Beatrice and Edwina and Paulette, and they're three different kinds of chickens. They are currently very dramatic right now because the weather is getting colder, and so they've just
Yeah.
changed out all of their feathers, and it requires a lot of energy. So they've been very cranky, and they haven't been laying
Mhm.
any eggs. But they're very spoiled, and they're generally very happy. We let them
Mhm.
outside a little bit today, and they seem to still think that there are worms in the ground, so they're just digging all over my yard. It's very
So
sweet.
cute. Yeah. That's great to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm also glad that, all of your chickens are doing fine. I heard that they are spoiled, and great to know, great to confirm that they are.
Indeed, they are.
Anyway, let's go on to the book questions. Of course, we're
Mhm.
so excited to talk about the magic fish. So, our first question would be, why did you choose the graphic novel medium to tell your story?
I chose the graphic novel medium because it's the medium in which I'm most comfortable. I'm someone who has never really considered himself to be a writer or an author. I'm someone who had a lot of aspirations to work somewhere within the realm of interacting with visual artwork or with ephemera. I really like looking at advertisements. I was really fascinated with the history of advertising and the kind of the history of illustration within a Western canon. And so all of those different things kind of contributed to my understanding of images as just a different kind of text that you can
Yeah.
consume. So I've always loved comic books and I've always loved illustrated books. And to my mind, they're two very distinct things that serve very different purposes. And I think that there's all kinds of incredible potential for comic books and for graphic novels to tell very specific stories and convey very specific ideas that readers can pick up on. And I love that about it. And so comic books are just my absolute favorite medium to work in.
And just curious also, since you're an illustrator and you have a very wide background as an artist, did you ever think that, collaborating with an author at some point, or were you just fixed on, writing your own story, writing your own book?
I honestly always assumed that I would be working with a writer because the only
Mm.
thing that I had ever written before the Magic Fish was literally essays for college, and that I hadn't done that in like almost a decade by the time I'd started making the Magic Fish. So I don't have any background in writing. I didn't know how to write a script. I didn't really know what my storytelling sensibilities were, and so I always assumed that I would be working with a writer. And when Random House Graphic gave me this fantastic opportunity to tell my own story, I had to do a lot of learning on the job, but I really enjoy the sense of control and the sense of wholeness that comes with being able to draw and write my own story. So I enjoy that a lot. I assumed I would be working with a writer for my first major project, but that wound up not happening. And I really like storytelling and I really like writing, and it came a lot more naturally to me than I thought it was going to.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. The story, the illustrations are both equally amazing, and it just amazes me that you haven't had, a project prior to this one, because the book turned out to be super incredible. So congratulations
Oh, thank you
to
so much.
you. Yeah. So how did you develop your art style? Have you been drawing since you were young, and how would you describe your art style?
Um, I always have a bit of difficulty describing my art style. There are a lot of really obvious influences, and I love to talk about those. My interest in looking at ephemera from the golden age of illustration, so looking at books in the early 20th century, children's books, illustrated books, opera pamphlets, movie theater, just like all kinds of different ephemeral illustrations. Those are all things that are kind of present in my illustration style, but I also grew up reading a lot of manga and a lot of comic books, and I read a lot of Archie comics and Garfield, and I loved reading Sailor Moon and Cardcaptor Sakura, and so you can see all of those things kind of present in my work. I think I like to make my my favorite sources of inspiration and the things that influence me really obvious in my work, and I like to talk about it in the back matter as well. So it's something that I should get a little bit better at describing, because it's a question that I'm asked and I love answering it, but I haven't come up with a concise way to say it quite yet. But that's as close as I've gotten to concisely describing my art style. And I've worked that way. I think ever since I was in college, because that was when I started really seriously looking at all of the artists that I was interested in. And so I loved Kai Nielsen and Rose O'Neill and Arthur Rackham, and all of these different kind of fairy tale illustrators were people that I always kind of carried with me. And I also didn't really recognize that the narratives that they were attached to were going to be things that, were very special to me, that I would carry with me for all of my life. So, yeah, yes, that's kind of when and how I started developing my art style that way. And I think a part of it was also just the fact that it's so, I find the repetitive line making to be very soothing. It's not as difficult as it looks. I think actually the very busy parts of the drawings, the drawing parts with lots of lines in them, those are the easiest parts for me, because if you make a mistake,
Wow.
you can just draw another line right next to it. But the parts where the line work is very spare, that's the very difficult parts, because you have to say exactly what you need to say with just one line, and that's really hard. So there's a little bit of ease of pressure when there are more lines around there. So it's actually quite a bit of a load off when I'm drawing.
Yeah, that's interesting that you said that you have like a lot of influences, and yet you were able to take chunks from those influences and from those inspirations and come up with what's uniquely yours. So that's really great. Yeah. And going
Thank you.
through with that, you're welcome. Going through with the story of the magic fish, and of course the illustrations as well. It has a very particular color palette. You used primary colors to illustrate your drawings. Was there a reason for choosing the colors that you did? And of course, could you share with us what the book is about?
Oh, sure, of course. So The Magic Fish is about an immigrant family that was a lot like mine in my experience growing up. So it's about a young boy who is in middle school named Tien, and his mother and his parents are, they're very busy first generation immigrants. They have a lot of things on their plate. They have very practical priorities. And so Tien sort of recognizes that, and he has a lot of trepidation kind of bringing up his personal problems to his parents in general, because he understands that they've been through quite a lot of trauma. Immigrant children often have this sort of outsized sense of empathy for their parents' experiences, because we're sort of used to hearing a lot of stories of very specific and particular kinds of trauma from our parents. And so there's this hesitance to burden his mother and father with things like his burgeoning sense of sexuality in himself. And so he finds that he really, really wants to be able to communicate this with his parents, and his mother in particular. And they don't share a common language or culture. And so he doesn't know how his mother feels about it. And he doesn't know quite what words to use to convey that specific idea, because he doesn't know if that idea exists, because it's never been spoken about with a common language between them. And so they both kind of communicate with each other kind of circuitously by reading each other fairy tales that they've chosen from the library as sort of a bedtime ritual. And so that's sort of the long and the short of The Magic Fish.
Yes, it's a very heartwarming read, and everything about it is just beautiful. The story and the illustration are both equally beautiful. And I just got reminded when I finished the book that it's really just about empathy, towards other people. Like, we have
Mhm.
our own story. We also play very important part in other people's stories. So it's very important to, just sometimes to sit down and listen and keep an open heart, keep an open mind, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that empathy was something that I didn't really think about until I was partway through the book, and I realized that
Mhm.
I mean, I was asked to write a young adult graphic novel, and it is, but I think I sort of cheated a little bit because the protagonist is a middle schooler, so he's a middle grade reader, and the deuteragonist is his mother, and so she's like a woman in her mid to late 30s, and so if you kind of average out those ages, they kind of average out to a young adult age.
Mhm.
But I wanted to make a project that was empathetic to my parents, because if
Mhm.
you're, if you're someone who kind of lives between cultures and your parents are trying their best to make sure that they're providing everything that you need in order to survive, oftentimes there is this sense of be bereavement a little bit, that they aren't able to fully participate in the culture, and there are things that they can't provide for you that you see other kids sort of having, and writing from that sense of understanding that people are at where they're at, and they have the
Mhm.
tools that they have wherever it is that they find themselves in their lives, and that
Mhm.
people are doing their best, regardless of whatever pieces they're missing. I think that's sort of
Yeah.
the core of the Magic Fish.
Yes, and you also mentioned that sort of supposed to be like a young adult book, right? But just a question as well, the story unfolds from the eyes of a kid, and this is a coming of age story. Um, Nobody is, he feels lost, and there's a sense of longing and a sense of trying to understand more about himself through the eyes of other people as well. So why did you choose to tell the story from a perspective of a kid, whereas to, somebody who is an adolescent, or like somebody who is like 13, or like in his early 20s?
Sure. Well, I think I was just more interested in the dialogue intergenerationally between these two characters
Mm,
at a specific moment in each of their lives. And so I was
mm,
just more comfortable writing from their perspectives for the sake of this particular story.
mhm.
I think I don't actually think that hard about who the proper age group or audience
Mhm.
is for my books when I make them,
Yeah.
because I don't find that that is a prohibitive thing. I think people who are interested in whatever stories you have to tell will read whatever they can get their hands on, and I have a lot of
Mhm.
faith in people being able to extend their sense of empathy to people who
Yes.
are different from them, and so I
Mhm.
didn't necessarily write it for maybe the audience that it was intended for by the publisher, but I
Mhm.
think that it definitely resonated with people from a pretty broad age range. So I was pretty comfortable writing from the eyes of a kid.
Yes, exactly. Even though that I'm far off, from the intended audience, I definitely would say that I resonated with it so much. I was able to connect with the protagonist, even the mom, and the entire story. So yes, I really do agree with you on that. So moving forward, and I would just like to go back to my previous question because I'm just
Mm.
really curious about it. Um, you've used a particular color palette, right? So was
Mhm.
there a reason for choosing the colors that you did to illustrate the drawings in your book?
Yes, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is practical, and the other one is artistic. And so,
Mhm.
when I was approached to make the graphic novel, I knew that coloring was not something that I was very strong with. And so I was
Mm.
very upfront with my editors. I told them that this
Wow.
is a shortcoming that I have. I'm not a very experienced colorist. I originally pitched the book to be printed in black and white, but they really wanted to be able to utilize the full capacity of the color palettes that were
Mhm.
available to the printers. And so we came up with a compromise. They said, why don't you use a limited palette? And because the stories take place in and out of different story universes and at different moments in different characters' lives, my editor actually suggested using different color palettes for each one so that I didn't have to, make a little didactic telling people, where they are in the story. And so the reader could eventually just pick up that, oh, like we're reading a story within the
Yeah,
context of this
exactly.
universe. Yeah. And so what ended up happening was that I chose the colors based on the sentiments that I was trying to convey, and it
Mhm.
wound up working out that the moments that were set in the past, especially in Helen's past, are this sort of kind of yellow ochre color. And I liked that because it sort of reminded me of sepia toned photographs, which gives people a sense of the past.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's also an early morning color. I kind of think of like morning sunshine when I think of those kind of warm yellows. And so that ended up being the past. And so the present, in the real world, is kind of pink and red. And I wanted it to be sort of a midday color, right in the middle of the day, very present minded. I wanted it to remind people of their heartbeat and their blood and the things that make them blush. And so it was sort of that kind of story universe. And the fairy tales are sort of told in this purple blue color, and I think of it as bedtime story colors. It's an evening color, and it's something I wanted to convey to the audience, that this was when the reading was taking place, is that there's sort of this warm bedtime story environment kind of wrapped around these sometimes rather visceral fairy stories.
Yeah. I kind of got the practicality of it while I was reading it. And to be honest, it was just so clear, even though those were different timelines, and it's a story within a story within a story, and that sounds kind of confusing. But when you read it, it's so clear. I didn't get any confusion or anything like that when I was reading
Good.
it.
I'm so glad to
And
hear that.
yes, and just um, appreciating the artistic side of it, now that you've mentioned it, made me appreciate. So the color of the motif of the water and the sea features heavily in your work as well. The element was used to portray different kinds of experiences. Let's say when Helen was making an escape, it was also used in the fairy tales to portray hope or possibilities. So, what does water symbolize for you in your graphic novel?
It wasn't something that I went in with a lot of intentionality in the beginning at all. I wasn't thinking about water as a symbol, but I think as I was developing the characters and as I got further along in writing the story, because I needed to have a script done first, and I found that that's kind of my comfort. I like having a script to work from, otherwise I don't really know what I'm drawing. Um, so eventually it kind of was revealed to me as I was sort of working out the characters and their motivations and their priorities, that the presence of the ocean and water in each of the fairy tales is sort of this kind of nod to an understanding that each of the characters feels a little bit unmoored, that they're on a strange shore, and that they kind of feel like when they kind of look out there, there's hope that there's land on the other side, but they might not be able to see it. I think because of the nature of transnational and diasporic family structures from all kinds of different moments of cultural upheaval or wars, there are frequently moments where people have to contend with the physicality of an ocean, and that sometimes comes to represent a lot more. And I didn't want to get too granular about what that meant to the individual characters. I sort of wanted that to be present so that people could sort of draw their own conclusions about what it meant to navigate oceans, both figurative and literal.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And why did you choose to tell the story of your own experience growing up? Did you intend for this book to be like a personal story in the first place?
Oh goodness, I did not intend for it to be a personal story at all. And then I
Really?
Yeah, and then I realized like,
That's
oh, like I guess I
interesting.
have something to say about this, this character's childhood that in a lot of ways was reflective of mine. I wanted to steer away from telling a story that was autobiographical, because at the time I was still in my 20s, and so I was like, I haven't lived enough life to write an autobiographical story. I feel like I don't have enough to say yet. I haven't lived enough life yet. And so I wanted to shy away from that. And I'm also of the understanding that, the truth is a little bit like memory is imperfect. And I didn't want to put myself in a position where I was maybe telling someone else's story, because there are a lot of different characters that interact. And so I was very adamant that this is going to be a work of fiction. And I did draw from some experiences that I had growing up, but I liked the freedom of being able to make all of it up. And I think the impetus of making the book was that I just wanted to draw my favorite fairy tales in graphic novel format.
Yes.
The story like that anchors the magic fish actually came second. It came later, and it was a process of my examination of why these specific fairy tales meant a lot to me as a person who, kind of exists within all of these different identities, and how that impacts the ways that these stories resonated with me. And so I think the story within a story format kind of came up a little bit later, but it wound up being surprisingly personal. I think there was a moment long after I'd finished writing the script, and actually while I was drawing it, and I think it was the moment when Helen finds out that her mother dies, that I was like, oh, I have a lot of feelings about this. Actually, that's when it actually hit me. It didn't seem to hit me while I was writing the story, but as soon as I drew it, and as soon as it became this tangible moment that I could observe in front of me, it really hit me emotionally. And that was when I knew. I was like, oh, I guess I'm in it personally now.
Yes, and can I just say that those feelings that you felt really transcended to the readers. Yes, because really, I cried towards the end of the book. It was just so beautiful. I don't want to give anything away, no spoilers, but it was just an intimate moment. And even though that I have not experienced it personally, I really resonated with it. And it was just a story that can touch your heart, even though you haven't experienced it on a personal level. So one of the things that I really also loved about the book is what you've mentioned, the fairy tales, because our protagonist, Tien, is a young boy, right? And for fairy tales, we often depict it, or we often associate it with young girls. And, fairy tales as well, when you read the book, some have happy endings, and, some don't have happy endings. And you also associated fairy tales with your own immigrant experience. So can you, tell us more about those things that you've added into your own tellings of fairy tales?
Sure. I love fairy tales, and I love them because they're so tricky to nail down. And I don't think that we're meant to really fully understand them or nail them down. I think I spent a lot of time when I was a teenager trying to find like what was the source of all of these stories. What were the oldest fairy tales? What were the originals? And I think as I got older, that became less and less important to me to find out, because then I became more fascinated in the fact that here is this wonderful example of this sort of constant, where a lot of different cultures tell very similar or very analogous stories. And based on all of the differences that I could observe from the different stories, I got this sense of what different people's priorities were, and where people happened to find themselves culturally, and what they valued, and the heroes that they wanted to see. And it kind of it really drove home the notion that stories that are shared in this sort of oral tradition, very colloquial kind of way, those stories tell you a lot about the storytellers. The content of the story might be very similar, but they tell you a lot about the people who are telling the story, and that becomes this act of imparting. It becomes community building, and it becomes legacy building in this very accessible and very warm human way. And I think that's why fairy tales have always really resonated with me, is because they're so messy and they're so imperfect, and the characters are flat and they don't have a lot of psychology, but they're still funny and they're still thrilling in all of these ways, because we put ourselves there, because we don't have these
Yes.
experiences necessarily, but we can draw parallels and we can exercise our empathy, and fairy tales kind of give us the bare bones to do that. And the fairy tales that I chose for the Magic Fish, so there are three main ones, and there are two different iterations of Cinderella. One is a German and English variant, one is the Vietnamese iteration of Cinderella, and the last story is The Little Mermaid. And those are all stories that have sort of been popularized and sort of capitalized upon by the Western canon. The popular imagination is filled with all kinds of, princess stories and fairy tales. And those kinds of fairy tales, the romances and the princesses and the princes and the falling in love and the magic spells, those are actually not terribly common within fairy tales. And so the notion that they stand in for expressions of gender and for femininity and for a certain kind of sentimental tenderness is kind of a new thing. And I think that's also fascinating, because that tells us a little bit about what the spaces that produced those stories, what their priorities are, and like what their values are, like I said before. And so that becomes actually a part of the way that I chose to tell the story of the Magic Fish as well, because that popularized, westernized, kind of popular imagination notion of fairy tales is the perspective that the stories are told from Tien. And when Helen tells the story, they look different because she grew up with, a different visual vocabulary, and her cultural influences are different. The media she consumed is different. So each of the stories are visually represented in a way that gets you to empathize with the characters' visual imaginations, and gets you to think about, like what did they see growing up, and what were the things that they found beautiful, and what were the things that really moved them, and what did they find sentimental. And because fairy tales are written so flatly, and because they're told with characters that don't have a lot of internal psychology, being able to tell a story about characters that are telling fairy tales gives you a stronger sense of what the characters are projecting onto the fairy tale flat characters. And I loved that as a tool, and I really liked being able to use fairy tales in that way.
Yes, and it actually became a very effective way of telling the story of both Helen and Tien. And I just love the idea that it was something that connected the both of them, even though that there was a barrier. So moving forward, what was your approach to writing a story about blatant immigrant themes? And did you feel any pressure about, accurately representing your community?
I think when I went in and actually pulled all of the pieces of the story together and realized that I was about to tell an immigrant story, I did feel a lot of pressure to accurately represent my community. And I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I had to do a lot of personal examination about what my relationship was to that dialogue. And I think where I landed, and I'm sure that maybe I'll evolve on this particular perspective or something, but where I landed at the time was that I wanted to relieve myself of the pressure of telling a story that is representative of a large swath of people. I think one of the challenging things about being a writer who writes about identities from the margins is that you're oftentimes tasked with edifying an audience. You're oftentimes given this special responsibility to teach people about your experience. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to engage with people's sense of empathy. I didn't want to engage with their curiosity. If they wanted to learn more about immigrants, there are lots of academic resources. There are a lot of news resources where they can sort of dive in and give themselves a better sense of this sort of eagle's eye view of an immigrant narrative. And so I set off to tell a story story that was kind of small in scope. I wanted to tell a story where the characters could be fully realized and you could see what their, individual motivations were, and that they're not necessarily a teaching tool for a large swath of a population. And so I sort of I don't believe that it was like an irresponsible thing to do, but I do think that it did matter to me to be able to tell a story where I could assert that immigrants are not just an issue that you read about in the news and not just something that you can academicize and hold at arm's length. I wanted to tell a story where you feel for the characters. And so that was sort of where I landed and when I started actually fleshing out the tale.
Yes, and it was actually a personal story, right? You were just also sharing a piece of yourself in the book, and Magic Fish is just deeply moving and again at times very emotional. And as I was saying, I resonated with it even if I have not experienced it personally, and I really appreciated that it's just seeing forms of different struggles, not just in the eyes of Tien, but also from Helen's perspective. She was also trying to overcome her personal struggles and just trying to connect with her son as well. So with this, did you experience any difficulty in writing this book? It's quite emotional, and were there any parts that you found difficult to write or even illustrate?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the moments where the characters are weighed down by a sense of loss were very difficult for me to draw. They were not difficult for me to write, and I think that's partly because writing feels impersonal to me. Like I said, the only thing I'd ever written before the Magic Fish were essays for classes, and so the Magic Fish is actually kind of structured like an essay, right? There's a sort of a thesis at the beginning, and then there are 3 kind of supporting paragraphs in the middle, and then it sort of ties back up nicely at the end. And so it sort of follows that format. And so while I was writing it, I was convinced that this wasn't something that was going to affect me emotionally, that I could hold this at arm's length. I had to intellectualize the experience of being an immigrant and of queerness and wrestling with all of those different identities. I had those sort of figured out and ironed out in my brain. And then as I was drawing the story and as the characters became more real, it was very difficult to draw things all the way through, and I did have to kind of take a little bit of a break sometimes to sort of collect myself. It was very astonishing to me, and it's one of those challenges that I don't know why I did not foresee in terms of creating a book, because it is something that engages with an emotional experience, but it's also my work. And this is new work for me. And so I'd never really experienced a work where I was emotionally invested in the nuts and bolts of the storytelling. And so it surprised me.
It's so surprising that other writers would have difficulty in writing it, but since you're an illustrator and you're a visual artist, it really does make sense that it would hit you more on the illustration part. So aside from that, clothing and language also played a huge part in both Tien's stories and in the fairy tales. The clothing and the dresses, especially in the fairy tales, were so gorgeous and then so astonishing. Why did you choose to highlight these aspects of your culture in particular? The language barriers and the clothing.
Sure. Well, I think drawing on visual vocabulary is something that is special to visual media. It's not exclusive to comic books. Obviously, there are wonderfully constructed films and stage productions that make use of people's visual vocabularies to great effect. And it was something that I really wanted to do in a comic book, because at some point I was given the advice that if I were to make a comic book, the clothes should be as plain as possible so that it can look timeless. And I really disagreed with that. I strongly believe that a work is is so much more powerful when it's very intentional about being in the moment that it was made, and in the moment
Yeah.
where it was intended to be conveyed. And so I was very intentional about making sure that all of the clothes were things that were familiar to me, and I did a lot of research into what looked right and what people wore and
Yeah.
why people wore what they did in order to convey themes of power, in order to convey comfort, and in order to convey a sense of like fantasy and escape. And so for each of the different fairy tale segments, I mentioned before that they're told from the visual imagination of each of the characters. And so for Thean's part, I ended up doing a lot of research into why princess dresses look the way that they do. Why do they have this silhouette? Why are the skirts
Yeah.
so billowing, and why are the bodices so small, and why do they look like this? And I wound up learning a lot about kind of post World War II economy in terms of fashion and available fabrics, and how everything that we wear is based on the material availability of a lot of things. And so all of these things that I completely had taken for granted, that were just sort of a part of the cultural milieu of what was going on in my imagination, I got to dig in a little bit and recognize why things looked the way that they did, and I loved doing that. And so I had to do that for the other two stories as well. It was very important for me um, to draw the ao dai, the Vietnamese national dress, because it was something that I always wanted to see in a fairy tale. Like, I'd grown up seeing lots of different
Aw.
Disney movies and that sort of thing, and I'd never, it was one of those things where I, believe in the audience's or the reader's empathy, being able to access all of these things that are outside of their experience. But there was something so special about being able to recognize yourself in the media that you create. And so I wanted for just a moment to be able to make a story where I could feature this dress that, is so culturally specific, that is the result of colonialism and imperialism, and that is also incredibly sentimentally important and politically important to Vietnamese people. And it's such a beautiful little symbol of all of the different cultural influences that have gone in and out of Vietnam over the past centuries. And so it was very important for me to be able to convey that. And my parents really enjoyed that. And so I was so happy. I was like, okay, I think I've done my job. This is what I wanted to do.
Yes. While you were satisfied and while you enjoyed researching about it and learning more about these things, it was also equally satisfying for us to see the product of your hard work, all of the things that you have done, not just as an illustrator, but the things that you have researched and worked on in the back end. Because seeing that, it also made me realize that um, there's so much more, to just fairy tales in the Western, and we need more artists like you to be empowered and to be, we need more materials like the magic fish. And thank you so much, because you have just inspired, more people, not just young people, but immigrants and people of color to do the same.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that warms my heart. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And now that your story is out in the world and it's a very personal story, how does it feel to lay yourself bare out there? When people read it, when say that they could resonate with it, they could really feel the emotions in the book. So how does it feel?
um, well, uh, that isn't something that has an enormous impact on my process and my day to day. Honestly, I'm a big believer in the ways that stories are personal to whoever it is who consumes it. And so um, I have my own relationship to the magic fish, and that's important to me. But I don't really think that there's a wrong way to read it. I really strongly hold that every reader's relationship to that text is going to be personal to them, and it might be different than mine in a lot of ways, and that's also fine. And they're going to bring whatever they bring to the table. And so the notion that it's a personal story is not something that makes me feel more exposed at all, because I think that the story, as soon as it's filtered through the imagination of a reader whose worldviews and whose experiences are different from mine, their relationship to it is necessarily going to be different, and it's not going to be um, it won't make me feel like they've been granted access to this like special part of me at all. Like it
Yeah.
still feels very, very balanced to me. So I don't really feel a way about being very open about these things. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions if people want to ask me about them, but it's not something that brings me any amount of anxiety. I'm really happy that people get to facilitate their own understanding of the story.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And our last question for this part of the interview is, of course, what is your hope for people of color and immigrant stories being told in literature, in the media, and other medium? Yeah.
Okay. Um, I'm sure this answer will change from time to time, but in this moment, I'm going to give you what I have right now. And that is that we talked before about the pressure that I felt to represent accurately or respectfully um, this swath of the population of people who might share identities with me. And I wanted to relieve myself
Yeah.
of that. And I want that, I think, for everybody. I think one of the discussions about how to solve problems of diversity in media and in publishing tends to come from well-intentioned individuals who want to make sure that they're doing things correctly. And I think that people can do their best, but like the core of the magic fish, people have what they have and they only have the experiences that they have. And so the best that they can do is the best that they can do. So you might get things wrong. But I think that the pressure to get everything absolutely correctly is relieved every time there are more voices available out there. I think we're looking for plenitude. We're not looking for like precise, accurate representation. We're looking for many different voices. And my attitude about diversity in publishing is just is always going to be yes and. If something doesn't resonate with me exactly, that's great. I hope that there can be more stories for me to choose from. And so I want people of color, I want people from marginalized background, authors and creators of all stripes, to be relieved of the responsibility of being the sole arbiter or being the sole story that is told within their sphere of culture. I want them to be able to have the freedom to be messy and to make mistakes and to not be precious about the narratives that they produce, because storytelling should be fun and it should be accessible and it should be this wonderful, beautiful, messy thing. And I want that for everyone.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That answer just melted my heart. Thank you so much. The magic fish is just inspiring. It's beautiful, and I know for sure that um, people who get the chance to read it will not just love it, but also get to live the story and empathize with the characters. So we're done for our first part of the interview. Thank you so much for all of the generous answers that you've given to us. Now for the second part, this is going to be the fast talk Doodle edition. So I believe that you have your writing instrument ready.
Mhm. Okay.
Yes. All right. So this part of the interview, you have 10 to 15 seconds to answer the following prompts with a doodle drawing. All right. So are you ready?
Okay. Yes.
All right. So first question. If you were to introduce people to Vietnamese food for the first time, what dish would you make them try?
Okay.
Okay, your
10 to
timer
15
starts
seconds.
now.
Okay.
I'm so excited to see the drawing.
Okay. It's going to be so fast and it's going to be so messy, but I can't wait. I hope it turns out okay.
All
Mm,
right, timer stops now.
okay.
All
Okay.
right,
So as
let's
far as
see
Vietnamese
what
food
we
goes,
got.
there is a, oh, I don't know if you can see it very well on the screen. Ah, there we go. Okay.
There.
So there is a Vietnamese style crepe called a bánh xèo. And I love it so
Ooh.
much. It's very easy to make. It's just a lot of batter and it's fish sauce and it's shrimp. And it's you can really only eat it after it's just been made, because it does not reheat well and the texture changes completely. But it's my favorite thing, and my parents make it oftentimes when I come home and there's this huge setup and it's always this sort of community activity. I love it very much. Yeah, so it's definitely the
Sounds
Vietnamese.
delicious.
Mhm.
Yeah. We hope we didn't make you crave for it though.
Oh no, I'm very hungry right now.
All right, for the second question, draw your pets. Go.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Do you have other pets other than the chickens? Do you have dogs or
No,
cats?
I am allergic to cats, even though I adore them, and my partner is allergic to dogs, and so we can't have furry animals inside, and
Oh,
chickens were sort of
chickens.
our,
Yeah,
yeah, they were our compromise.
chickens are perfect. All right, stop.
Okay. And here's my little chicken.
Cute. Oh my gosh, you
Not
only
bad
did that
10
for like
seconds.
15 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, for the third question, what are your favorite art tools?
Favorite art tools. Okay.
Go. You know, these tools that you always use or tools that you can't live without. All right, 3 seconds, 2, 1, and stop.
Okay. So my favorite traditional tool to use are micron pens. They're fine liners, and so they're they produce very, very fine little lines. And I don't know that that was super clear in the drawing, but a micron pen and like a little sketchbook is something that I love to use. I like being able to draw while I'm traveling.
Did you also use these tools while you were making the magic fish, or
Yes, the whole first part of the whole first 2/3 of the magic fish was drawn traditionally, and so I used just plain office paper. I bought like white cardstock, and I just drew with mechanical pencil, and I used the fine liner, and I would clean it up and erase it. It was all very accessible. It was only in the last third of the magic fish where I really needed to hit my deadlines, and so I had to switch over to drawing.
But wow, really great that you were able to make it like traditionally. Wow, hats off to you.
It was very
Okay.
difficult.
For the last question, draw a hobby that you picked during the pandemic. Go.
Okay.
I'm curious about this. And my guess would be knitting because everybody seems to be knitting nowadays. All right, 3 seconds, 2, 1, and stop.
Okay. It is not. I ended up just picking up a lot of video games.
Oh, great. What have you been playing?
I have been playing a lot of, I started playing the Assassin's Creed games because they're so well researched, and they have this really lovely tourist mode where you can explore just like the different architecture and the different,
Yeah.
you know, like the landmarks in the game, and it's so beautifully done. So I very much enjoyed my
I
time
also
with those
enjoy
games.
playing that, but I haven't finished it though.
They're very long. I have only finished one of them.
All right, for this part of the fast talk, you don't have to draw them, just answer
Okay.
them really quickly without, thinking too much. So number 1 would be, what superstitious belief from Vietnamese culture do you keep? Or is there any?
Balut. We actually eat balut in Vietnam.
Oh.
It's called something different. I forget what it's called. But yeah, Vietnamese people believe it's good luck to eat it. It changes your luck. So if you're experiencing a lot of good luck, you don't eat the balut. But if you're having a series of really terrible luck, you need to eat balut. I personally really enjoyed it as a kid.
All right, number 2. What helps you get in the zone when drawing or working?
Ooh, I like listening to music that my parents listen to. They listen to a lot of what we consider to be dad rock. So I listen to a lot of like the Bee Gees or Orleans. So kind of just like 70s and 80s kind of pop rock music. It's like a lot of songwriting from like middle-aged men who've been to therapy, and so it's very thoughtful.
But something to get you into the groove, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Number three, would you rather be on the best-selling list forever or win a literary award? Well, you already won an award, but another one.
Um, oh no. Okay. I think I would rather be. I think I would rather be a bestseller because every time, every time I win something, I have to check with my agent or with my editors, and I'm like, "What is the context for this award?" Um, so I'm just learning about the award circuit. It wasn't something I'd ever thought about before. So, and I think either one of those things would help me continue to be able to make more books. But I think the more solid one is book sales, honestly.
All right, fair enough. And number four, what piece of advice would you give yourself when you started writing this graphic novel?
um, okay, I think the thing that surprised me the most is that I am not actually a visually oriented person when it comes to storytelling. I need to have the writing done first. I tried to do the drawing and the writing at the same time. It didn't work for me. I needed to have a scaffolding, I needed structure, so I needed to write first. That's what I would tell myself.
All right, because I was expecting that, I should um, draw the illustrations digitally rather than traditionally. But okay, good answer. All right, and lastly, for the fully booked signature question, do
Mhm.
you judge a book by its cover?
Well, I can't judge the book itself by its cover, but I do judge the cover for its cover. I'm picky about covers, and I like looking at them, and I like understanding what decisions editorially and design-wise went into them.
Mhm.
Um, so kind of this is sort of a cop-out, but yes and no. I can't judge the book by its cover, but I can certainly judge the cover by its cover.
All right, fair enough. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for your time. We really enjoyed talking with you, getting to know you, and of course, the magic fish.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you about the book.
And of course, bookworms, thank you so much for joining us as well. Get a copy of The Magic Fish, of course, on Fully Booked online. And if you have anything you want to promote, Trung, your Instagram account maybe,
I can be
or any
found on the
projects.
internet, yeah, everywhere at Trungles. So I'm on Instagram
Mhm.
at Trungles, and I'm on Twitter at Trungles. I'm busiest at both of those places. I'm
All right.
currently working on my second graphic novel, but it doesn't have a title yet, so we don't know a whole
Yes.
lot about it. But it's happening. Yes,
Congratulations. We
thank you.
can't wait to have you here, hopefully personally here in the Philippines when you released your second graphic novel. We'd love to have you over here.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That's the dream. I would love to visit.
Thank you so much again, Trang, and thank you, bookworms. Stay safe and keep on reading.